I want to start today with a confession. For years, I worked with music on in the background, all kinds of music, and I genuinely believed it was helping me. It felt good, it felt energizing, and I thought it was making me more productive. And then I learned something about the brain that made me go back and look at some of the work I'd done in those sessions. And I started to wonder. Because it turns out the brain is doing something very specific when it hears music. And what it's doing depends entirely on the kind of music, the kind of work, and the kind of brain that's listening. In that case, it was mine. Get the combination right, and the research suggests you can genuinely extend your focus and improve your output. Get it wrong, and you may be working against yourself without knowing it. Today, Cole and I are going to take you through what the neuroscience actually says. And by the end of this conversation, you'll probably want to change what is playing in your headphones right now.
Welcome back to My Brainwise Coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
We are so thrilled that you've joined us for another episode where we are going to understand the neuroscience of music, which will be a fascinating conversation. And as always, if you're finding this podcast or these conversations enlightening, give us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is that you get your podcasts, and comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms at My Brainwise Coach. It really does help our growing Brainwise community find new friends. So Phil, let's start at the beginning. Why does music have such a powerful effect on all of us at all? Because it clearly does. Anyone who has ever had a piece of music reduce them to tears in a public place knows this. But we don't often stop to ask why.
And this is where Daniel Levitin's work is so incredibly illuminating. Levitin was a neuroscientist at McGill University, but he came to neuroscience a strange way. He came from music. He was a session musician and record producer who worked with Stevie Wonder, amongst others. And then he went back to university because he wanted to understand what was actually happening in the brain when music did what he knew it could do. His book, This Is Your Brain on Music, is incredibly detailed, but it's probably the most accessible account of the neuroscience of music that's ever been written. And his central finding is this: music is not processed in one part of the brain. It's processed almost everywhere.
Wait a minute. What do you mean by almost everywhere?
All over the brain. When you listen to music, your auditory cortex is processing the sound, obviously, but your cerebellum is engaged by the rhythm. The same structure that coordinates your movement is also responding to the beat. Your motor cortex is activated, which is why you tap your foot without deciding to. At least I do. Most people do. Your limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, is processing the emotional content of what you're hearing and linking it back to your memory. The prefrontal cortex is tracking the structure, predicting what comes next, and registering surprise or satisfaction when those predictions are confirmed or violated. And finally, your nucleus accumbens, the brain's primary reward circuit, is releasing dopamine in response to the music you love.
So music is essentially giving the brain a full body workout to some degree.
That's, in fact, one way of looking at it. Levitin's phrase is, quotes, a choreography of neurochemical release and uptake. And the dopamine point is important. The same reward circuit, get this, that responds to food, to sex, to social connection, responds to music. Not in a metaphorical way, in a measurable, neurochemical, this is your brain on music way.
Which explains why music can be so addictive. Why you can listen to the same song 50 times and it still produces a similar response.
Exactly. And Levitin has a beautiful observation about why that happens. He calls it the brain is a prediction machine. We've discussed that before. When you listen to music, you're constantly predicting what comes next. The next note, the next chord, the next resolution of a musical phrase. When the music confirms your prediction in a satisfying way, you get a small dopamine hit. When it surprises you in a delightful way, an unexpected chord, a resolution that goes somewhere you didn't expect but that feels good, you get an even larger one. The greatest composers and musicians are, in neurological terms, masters of that prediction and expectation management. They know exactly how to set up a prediction and either satisfy it or productively violate it. You're at the best of the fugues, and you're expecting the final two. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't.
So is this why certain pieces of music maybe give you chills, the physical sensation of your hair standing up on the back of your neck?
Not in your case, but that's exactly right. Levitin studied this. Those chills, he calls them frisson, are produced by moments of peak dopamine release. They tend to happen at moments of musical surprise, an unexpected modulation, a particularly powerful resolution, a voice entering in a way you didn't anticipate. Not everyone experiences frisson. It's more common in people who are high in the personality trait of openness to experience. But those who do are essentially experiencing a small neurochemical peak triggered by a moment of musical genius.
This is before we have even got to the question of what music does to your productivity. It's a lot.
We're building towards it because the reward and emotional architecture is the foundation. You need to understand why music has power before you can understand how to use that power and how it can go wrong.
There's something else in Levitin's work that I want you to explain for us, Phil, because it's one of those findings that immediately makes sense once you hear it, but that you had never articulated perhaps beforehand. The music you listen to as a teenager has a disproportionate emotional grip on you for the rest of your life. Why is this?
Tell me about it. I'm a Pink Floyd fan. Everything's being encoded more deeply.
And essentially, music is a part of that deeper encoding process.
To mix metaphors, music is right at the heart of it. The music you listen to between roughly 13 and 25 was playing during the period when your brain was deciding who you were and who it was. Those songs were the soundtrack to the formation of your identity, your first relationships, your defining emotional experiences. The hippocampus encodes them alongside the emotional and autobiographical memories of that period. So when you hear that song again at 50, no, you're not just hearing the song. You're triggering a neural pathway that connects to who you were, who you loved, and how you felt at that moment when those things mattered more than they ever would again.
Which is why a song can take you back to a specific moment with startling precision. The smell of someone's hair, the feeling of a particular summer evening.
Yeah, Marcel Proust had something to do with it. He wasn't a neuroscientist, but he made a famous observation about smell and memory that works equally for music. Both are processed in the brain in ways that connect directly to the hippocampus and the amygdala, bypassing the more deliberate cognitive processing that other stimuli go through. Music and smell arrive at memory and emotion faster than almost any other kind of input.
So the music streaming services that build kind of throwback playlists know exactly what they're doing from a neurological perspective.
They absolutely do. And it works both ways. The positive nostalgic power of familiar music from that period can be genuinely therapeutic. There is excellent evidence for music-based interventions in Alzheimer's patients, where familiar music from the formative years can activate memories and recognition even when much of the other cognitive function has been lost. The neural pathways built during those years are among the most deeply encoded and most resistant to the damage of neurodegeneration.
But let's talk about mood for a moment, because this is the most everyday use of music. Most people use it deliberately to change how they feel. Sad music when they want to feel something, energizing music for exercise, calming music when they are anxious, etc. Does the brain actually work in that way?
It does. And Levitin's work goes a long way to explain why that's happening at a neurochemical level. The brain's emotional state is partly a product of the neurochemical environment it's operating in. Dopamine drives motivation and reward. Serotonin regulates mood and well-being. Cortisol, as we know, is the stress hormone. Oxytocin is associated with social connection and trust. Music affects every one of them.
Give us some of the specifics behind that.
Yeah. Music you love releases dopamine, as we've said. But Levitin also found that the opioid system is engaged. The brain releases endogenous opioids in response to music, which is why music can genuinely relieve pain. There are clinical studies showing that post-surgical patients who listen to music that they choose require measurably less pain medication. The mechanism's real. Then there's cortisol, slow, structured, predictable music, particularly music around 60 beats a minute, which maps onto a relaxed resting heart rate, measurably reduces cortisol levels. This is why certain kinds of music genuinely calm you down rather than merely feeling calming.
And Jill, what about the synchrony phenomenon, i.e. the music and physical rhythm?
That's the cerebellum again. The brain has a deep preference for synchrony, for things that match its own rhythmic patterns. When music's tempo aligns with your movement or your intended state of arousal, the motor cortex and cerebellum respond by strengthening that state. This is why running to music at a tempo that matches your desired stride rate measurably improves both performance and perceived effort. You're essentially using the music to entrain the brain's own rhythmic systems to the state you want.
Which is why the wrong music for exercise can actually feel worse than perhaps no music at all.
Exactly right. If the tempo doesn't match, you're creating a mild conflict between your body's preferred rhythm and its expectations and the rhythm that the music is imposing. The brain finds this effortful in a way that's nothing to do with the music's quality. It's the mismatch that's the problem.
This is where we start to move from music as an emotional experience to music as a tool that you can use or sometimes also misuse.
You read my mind, which is exactly where I thought we should go next.
This is the section that, Phil, I expect will produce the most immediate recognition for our listeners or brainwise friends, because almost everyone has an opinion about whether they work better with music or without music. And most people have noticed that the people around them have very different preferences. So tell us, what does the neuroscience say about all of this?
Well, it says a lot, but the key framework comes from a guy called Hans Eisenach, who was a personality theorist. And in the 1960s, way back, he proposed that the fundamental neurological difference between introverts and extroverts is their baseline level of cortical arousal. Extroverts, Eisenach argued, have a lower baseline arousal level. Their brain is running at a lower level of stimulation at rest. This is why they seek external stimulation, noise, company, activity, everything going on at once. They need more input to reach their optimal cognitive state. On the other hand, introverts have a higher baseline arousal level. They're already running close to their optimal level of stimulation without any of that external input.
So the introvert who wants quiet to work and the extrovert who wants music or background noise are both essentially doing the same thing. They're trying to reach their optimal cognitive arousal state.
Bingo, you're exactly right. The extrovert who puts on energetic music at work is adding the external stimulation their brain needs to perform well. The introvert who puts on the same music may be pushing their already adequate arousal level past the point where they can focus. Too much stimulation produces the same performance decline as too little, the Yerkes-Dawson curve or inverted U. There's an optimal arousal level for any given cognitive task, and both too much and too little stimulation impair the performance.
So for an introvert doing demanding cognitive work, music might actually be making them worse in some cases.
Yeah, for demanding cognitive work, the kind requires sustained concentration, complex reasoning, careful writing. Yeah, that's the case. The research is pretty consistent on this. Introverts performing demanding tasks in silence consistently outperform Introverts performing the same tasks with music in the background. The music is adding arousal they do not need and cannot efficiently filter it out. For extroverts doing the same task, the music often produces no significant difference, or even just a modest improvement, because the stimulation is moving them toward their optimal rather than past it.
And what about less demanding tasks like routine work, data entry, or repetitive processing?
That's where it genuinely flips. For repetitive, low-demand tasks, introverts can also benefit from music, because repetitive tasks naturally produce a drop in arousal toward boredom, and music can counteract that. The finding from the research is that the complexity match matters. The cognitive demand of the task and the arousal level required should align with the stimulation the music provides. Simple task, stimulating music can work for everyone. Complex task, stimulating music typically impairs introverts and has mixed effects on extroverts.
What about the open plan office, which combines the worst of several of these factors simultaneously?
Oh, don't get me started. The open plan office is, from a neuroscience perspective, almost a near perfect environment for impairing cognitive performance across most personality types. It's just not a good idea. The noise is unpredictable, which is far more cognitively disruptive than consistent background noise at the same volume. The conversational noise is particularly damaging because the brain's social cognition systems can't entirely ignore intelligible speech. It automatically processes language even when you're trying not to listen. We've all had that. And the visual stimulation, movement, and activity competes for attentional resources that demanding cognitive work requires. We get distracted by a flash, a movement, whatever it might be.
Which is why so many people in open plan offices oftentimes reach for headphones.
And why what it is in those headphones matters enormously. Which brings us to, thank you for the introduction, Focus at Will.
So let's talk about Focus at Will, because I remember when it appeared and it seemed to be making quite a specific claim.
Yeah, his name was Will Henshall, and he's the founder of Focus at Will, hence the name. And he came to this from the music industry. He'd founded the British soul band London Beat and had significant hits in the 90s. And he combined his musical expertise with serious neuroscience research to build a platform specifically designed to help people focus while working. I actually met him in the 2000s. And what his team discovered after years of research, backed by EEG studies, is that most of the music people reach for when they want to focus is precisely the music that is worse for their focus. And the reason is something Henshall calls the human voice problem.
So, take us a couple clicks deeper on that, Phil.
The brain has a dedicated, highly sensitive, always-on detection system for the human voice. It's evolutionary. The voice carries social information, threat information, intention information that was critically important for survival. So the brain monitors continuously for sounds in the human voice frequency range, roughly 1 to 4 kilohertz, which is the frequency range that contains the intelligibility of speech. You cannot simply turn that monitoring off because you're trying to concentrate.
So in that case, anything with lyrics is immediately a potential problem.
That's right. Music with vocals is the most obvious version, yes. But Henshall's key finding was that the problem goes further than the lyrics. Instruments that produce sounds in the same frequency range as the human voice trigger the same monitoring response. The saxophone, the cello, the lead electric guitar. These instruments were designed in some cases deliberately, in some places simply because they sound beautiful, to produce tones that sit in the voice frequency range. And the brain, hearing them, can't entirely distinguish them from speech. It keeps half an ear on them, waiting to resolve whether this is a voice carrying meaningful information or not. That half an ear is attention you're not giving to your work.
Which half of your ear is it, Phil? No, just kidding. Which is somewhat counterintuitive because those are beautiful sounds, jazz with a saxophone, a Bach cello suite. These seem like ideal working music conditions.
They feel calming and pleasurable, which they are, but the focus research suggests they're not the best choice for demanding cognitive work, precisely because of that voice frequency activation. What works better, according to the Focus Will research, is music without vocals, without those voice range instruments, without breath sounds, and without the kind of dynamic variation that triggers the brain's orienting response, the automatic that fires in response to unexpected sounds.
So then tell us what does work in this case.
Ambient music, some types of classical music, particularly Baroque music, which tends to be structurally predictable and low in dynamic surprise. Post-rock and certainly electronic music without vocals and without voice range instruments. Music at a consistent, moderate tempo. Also, the Focus at Will approach also sequences the music carefully over time. They found that most people have a focus cycle of around 80 to 100 minutes before their attention naturally degrades, and they design the playlists to support that cycle rather than to fight it. Go back to the 90-minute rhythms, ultradian rhythms.
So the personality type dimension comes back into play here because the right choice of music also depends on whether you are an introvert or an extrovert.
Henshall's team found that people vary enormously in their distractibility, and that the appropriate music intensity should match their profile, what they call the distractibility scale. Someone at the high distractibility end of the scale, which tends to correlate with introversion and high baseline arousal, needs music that's lower intensity, more predictable, and more ambient. Someone at the low distractibility end, which tends to correlate with extroversion and the need for external stimulation, may benefit from more energetic, varied music. One playlist does not fit all brains.
So let's take a step back from the productivity question for a moment, because I think Levitin's more recent work goes somewhere more profound in music as a medicine.
His 2023 book, which is titled I Heard There Was a Secret Chord, is almost entirely devoted to this. And the evidence base is now significant. Music-based interventions have been shown to reduce anxiety before surgery more effectively than anti-anxiety medication in some studies. Music at around 60 beats per minute, below resting heart rate, measurably reduces cortisol and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and restore mode. Music therapy with Parkinson's patients has produced improvements in gait and movement that are genuinely remarkable, because the rhythmic entrainment that music produces engages the motor and cerebellum systems in ways that voluntary movement control sometimes cannot.
And because it's somewhat personal to me, the Alzheimer's case is the one that I find most moving.
It's extraordinary. There's well-documented evidence of patients in advanced Alzheimer's who appear unresponsive and disconnected, and who, when music from their formative years is played, become alert, engaged, sometimes singing words that they couldn't otherwise produce. The neural pathways built during those teenage years of deep encoding are among the last to be destroyed by the disease. Music reaches them when almost nothing else can. There's a documentary called Alive Inside that captures this with almost unbearable vividness.
So, Phil, what is the mechanism? Why does music survive neurodegeneration so much better than any other memory?
Partly, as we started off, because it's distributed across so many brain systems simultaneously. The processing is not localized in a single area that the disease can eliminate. Partly because the emotionally autobiographical encoding of formative music is so deep, we've talked about that earlier on. And partly because music activates the motor and cerebellum systems, which are differently affected by Alzheimer's than the cortical memory systems. The music takes a different route to the person, and sometimes it gets through.
So, Phil, let's bring this home for our brainwise friends. What should they actually do differently based on everything that we have covered in today's discussion?
First of all, know your personality type in the arousal sense. Are you someone who naturally seeks stimulation, who finds silence uncomfortable, and who performs better with noise in the background, just like my wife? Or are you someone who finds noise distracting and does your best thinking in quiet, like me? Your honest answer to that question should drive your music choices at work more than your taste does.
What's next?
Match the music to the task. For demanding cognitive work, writing, analysis, complex problem solving, music without vocals, without voice range instruments, at moderate and consistent volume, and at a tempo that doesn't demand your attention. Baroque classical, certain ambient. If you like classical, then Baroque. Have certain ambient music playing, lo-fi instrumental. For repetitive or physical work, more energetic music is fine and may genuinely help. For creative work, the research is mixed. There's evidence that moderate ambient noise rather than music can be beneficial for certain creative tasks by increasing what researchers call diffuse thinking.
What's next? What would be the third item?
Take the voice frequency finding very seriously. If you're listening to music with lyrics, jazz, saxophones, cello solos, lead guitar work during cognitively demanding tasks, you're likely paying more attention than you realize. The fact that it feels good doesn't mean your prefrontal cortex is not being quietly hijacked.
And fourth,
Use music deliberately for mood regulation. The brain's responsiveness to music's emotional content is real and powerful. If you need to shift your emotional state before, say, a difficult conversation, a challenging piece of work, or a situation that's making you anxious, music is one of the most effective neurological tools that we have available for doing so. The key is being intentional, choosing music for the state you want to create rather than simply defaulting to whatever's familiar.
focus at will principle, working with your natural attention cycle rather than against it. Remind us about that.
Most people's focused attention cycle, as we've talked a little bit about, is 90 minutes, 80 to 100 minutes. After that, the brain needs a reset before it can sustain high-quality focused work again. The right music can extend that cycle and smooth the transitions within it, but it can't override the biology. Knowing your own cycle and designing your workday around it, with music as a tool within that structure rather than a substitute for it, is probably the most practically useful thing any of us can take from today's conversation.
Phil, this is somewhat making me reconsider a lot of things because I'm going to go home and completely redesign my working playlists, which feels like exactly what this conversation is designed to elicit.
Exactly. That's the right response. Go, and it's different for everybody, and just find out what works for you. And I like one final thought from Levitin that I really find moving. He argues that music may be more fundamental to our species than language. That before we had words, we actually had rhythm and melody. And that social bonding function of music, the way it synchronizes brains and bodies in a shared emotional experience, may be one of the reasons our species is what it is. The concert, the church, the work song, the lullaby, they're not entertainment. They are the technology by which human beings have always synchronized themselves with each other. That we now understand the neurochemistry of how that works doesn't make it any less extraordinary. I believe it makes it more so.
So, for listeners who might want to go further into this information, Daniel Levitin's This Is Your Brain on Music is the starting point. His more recent book, I Heard There Was a Secret Chord, covers the therapeutic dimension, and the focus and platform is worth exploring if you work in cognitively demanding conditions and have never deliberately optimized what is in your ears. And if you want the broader framework or the neuroscience of what the brain needs and how to give it those things, that is what the Understand Your Brain series is for.
Yeah. Change the music, change the brain. It's not magic, it's neuroscience.
And as always, if you're enjoying this conversation, comment, share, and subscribe wherever it is you get your podcasts and on all of our social platforms at My Brainwise Coach. We are thoroughly enjoying continuing this conversation with you as we grow our Brainwise community. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay
Brainwise.